So welcome everyone. My name is Bill Barrett, and I'm a community representative on the steering committee of the Canada-India Research Center for Learning and Engagement, which is CIRCLE. So CIRCLE was established in February 2020 at the University of Guelph. The aim is to be an interdisciplinary nucleus in Canada for cutting-edge research on India and the Indian diaspora, to showcase, advocate, catalyze, and foster an equitable, respectful, and sustained exchange of knowledge between Canada and the Indian scholars on complex and emerging and unexplored topics related to sustainability and social economic well-being. And I'm broadcasting live from Guelph today. It's a beautiful day, sunny day. And so today we have a webinar with Bharat Punjabi. And so just a bit of our etiquette, we will entertain questions through the chat box, or if you want to raise your hand, then we'll recognize you if you'd like to speak as well. And so what I'd like to do now is just do a brief introduction of Bharat, who's a fine fellow. Bharat Punjabi has a PhD in human geography from the University of Western Ontario, where he researched intersectoral water conflict in the Mumbai region in coastal Western India. He's completed postdoctorate fellowships at the University of Toronto and the University of Guelph. His main interests are in water governance and policy in large metropolitan cities and urban studies. And he's currently teaching in the Asian Institute, which is part of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Guelph. Just to note that Guelph has a long history of water activism, and so this topic is particularly of interest to folks here in Guelph. So, Bharat, take it away, please.
Oh, thank you, Bill, for that introduction. And it's an honor being here at Guelph. Though we can't meet, in person, but, I've always followed Guelph's water activism very closely. And I hope that it's going to influence my work someday, even if it's on India. I draw a lot of inspiration from the, community participation and activism that has been taking place in Guelph. And then that is to, bring us to a topic, which is water in India. And my own interests with water actually began when I was a student in India, almost a decade and a half back. And I was actually working, on water problems and, as an activist and then as a researcher. And what brought me to Canada was both an interest in, exploring water ethnographically, but also looking at water from a kind of, policy perspective. Now, I know that many people don't do that, but I'm in my presentation today, I'll try to, integrate the two. And draw some attention to the kind of very vibrant policy context in India around water, and kind of marry that with the very rich ethnographic context of both Maharashtra and the state of Tamil Nadu. Now, most of you may not be aware, but last 5 years have been very busy as far as Indian water governance reform has been concerned. We've had a number of reports. Indian think tanks have produced a number of reports. They're very good at doing that. We need to get them to actually reform everything. But to start with, there was a report in 2018 by the Niti Aayog, which actually drew attention to the water crisis in India, which is very multidimensional. You have regions which are extremely water stressed. You have regions which are water scarce. There have always been water scarce regions in India where the availability has always been a challenge. And we've had a particular attention being paid to urban issues, but also issues of water supply, where the demand supply gap is narrowing. The Central Water Commission, which is a government body, came up with a report last year. But of particular importance was a committee headed by Mihir Shah, who's actually is an economist, but also an activist, who actually wrote a very important report in 2016, calling upon the kind of wholesale reform of Indian water governance. Okay, and he recommended basically that some of the late kind of colonial period bodies which were set up in India by the British, like the Central Water Commission, Central Groundwater Board, have become redundant. They're not doing their work properly. And what we need is a National Water Commission. And for those of you who are interested in his work in Shah's report, the report is available online. It's called A 21st Century Institutional Architecture of India's Water Reforms report. And this is separate from the Niti Aayog report, which I'll come to in a short while. But what Shah is basically trying to do with with his report and with the recommendations he's made is that he's trying to reform water law in India, at the federal level. This is very important. And as a result of his recommendations, a national water policy is being currently drafted. Now, as I said, we have a number of these reports. You also have non-profits and think tanks, both Indian and foreign, which are drafting important reports on the water crisis in India, and pointing out how urgent how badly we need solutions. Okay, and the current government's paying a lot of attention to it. But the challenge, as you would expect, is in a federal country like India, water tends to be a state subject, and you need a lot of state, central, local cooperation. But if there's one message that one can take from this report, from all these reports, is that that Indian water governance is in urgent need of decentralization. Now, decentralization means empowering local governments, but also adopting what we know in Canada is a watershed approach. We have these conservation authorities in Canada, which actually do a very good job of managing water at the local level and coordinating local needs and aspirations with the province and the federal level. So decentralization is one message which comes from the Shah report and from the other reports, that we need more participation by communities in urban, rural areas, and the states need to work that out. The one thing is a rather long quote. I'm sorry about that, but this also kind of captures the essence of the problem in India, where since the 1980s we've had both these organizations, the Central Water Commission and the Central Groundwater Board, highly oriented towards hydrogeology and civil engineering, actually dominating water management. And what the Shah report, for instance, recommended, that we need people from the social sciences, we need agronomists, we need other disciplines which need to have their own input into water policy. Okay, and this is a long-standing critique, which Shah has actually given more voice to in a government report, and this was also a critique made by the anti-dam, large dam movement in the 80s and 90s. But again, the fact that this has actually moved into official discourse is very, very significant. And there's been a big battle over this as well in the last 2-3 years, where there's been arguments on both sides whether we should do away with the Central Water Commission or not. But what Shah is actually saying is that we need to reduce their powers and have a new kind of national water commission which combines all these various expertises and not center everything around civil engineering and hydrogeology. So bring in ecological economists and bring in agronomists and bring in social sciences in terms of and seek their input on water governance. Some others have also said that this is not a crisis which is experienced everywhere, and it's not experienced in a kind of uniform manner, but it's important to kind of disentangle what the geographical, social dimensions of this crisis is. So you have water scarcity, where, as I said, there are certain areas which have always had long-standing water problems, arid areas. But then you also have areas which were kind of having good availability of water, especially in the north, where waters come under stress. Okay, and this is the focus of the Niti Aayog report, for instance, where you have groundwater being depleted at a very fast rate in states like the Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, but also in other states in Western India, where due to the kind of influence of the Green Revolution, we are depleting water faster than we can replenish it. Some others, from the political ecology perspective, which still is quite influential within India, are talking about, how access to water has always had an inequity damage. We've not had equal access to water, and many government reports and national sample survey reports actually have highlighted how people from the communities, from the lower castes and tribal communities have less access to water than upper caste communities. And finally, everyone agrees that this is a crisis of governance as well. This is a big crisis of governance, as I've just pointed out. And not just, that the country needs water laws that need to be reformed at the national level, but also at the local and state level, where there's a strong influence of a very colonial style of management of water, a very top to down, where communities are not involved. And also that, Indian water laws have what is called riparian influence. I'll dwell on that shortly when I come to the kind of summary of this presentation. This is a map I've taken from the Niti Aayog report, and it shows you that areas in the north are particularly highly stressed, where availability is less than 1,700 cubic meters per person per annum. Okay. That's a real problem according to water experts, hydrologists. Anything less than 1,500 is bad, and 1,700 we are nearing a situation where things are actually getting much worse, especially in the north and west of the country, and it includes pockets in Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, where you already have an agrarian crisis, which is compounded by the fact that water is not easily available. Demography plays a big role. India, as you know, is a highly populated country, and that actually adds to the stress, water stress, where you have growing population and less availability of water. But you look at the causes as to why this is happening. So this is just summarizing what I just showed you all. 600 million people facing high to extreme water stress. 75% of all households do not have drinking water on their premises. And the third and more important part is that, and you might have seen this in several BBC and New York Times reports as well, a lot of India's cities have water tanks which have become polluted, because we don't have proper sewage systems and a lot of waste gets into water. So average per capita water availability, which is already low enough, to be for a country to be categorized as water stressed, it's expected to be and those levels are expected to fall. And by 2025, the situation is going to be even much worse, according to the Niti Aayog report. And these are average numbers, okay? And in some areas, the situation is already bad, where availability could be lower than 1,000 cubic meters in more arid areas, especially because Indian farmers are also growing very water-intensive crops. This is again a very long quote I've taken from the Niti Aayog report, but it captures the kind of dilemma quite well. Not only are livelihoods under threat, but the fact that we have children dying out of lack of access to safe water, both in Indian cities and rural areas, shows as to how grave the crisis is. And as the situation gets worse, because as I said, this needs a kind of coordinated federal, state, local response. We are looking at very severe water scarcity by 2030, and also for a lot of economists, that's troubling because uncertainty around water could also lead to a decline in the country's growth rate, economic growth rate. For today's presentation, I've chosen to kind of highlight one important type of crisis within the overall kind of water challenge in India, and that is how we are seeing a kind of increase in rural-urban conflict. We know that India, large part of India's population, more than 50%, still lives in rural areas, depends on agriculture, but Indian cities are growing. So yeah, urban hinterlands and also large watersheds around dams, which are tapped for water for cities, are witnessing conflict, okay, between rural communities and urban areas. That's particularly marked, in terms of peri-urban areas, urban fringe areas where there's a transition going on from agriculture to industry and services, and peri-urban management is becoming very, very important in large metropolitan city regions in India. The one big problem I've found, I was doing my field work last decade and this decade, is that we still are growing water-intensive crops. Okay, I'll present some data on how agriculture takes away a lot of water, especially crops like rice. And so you have the scenario where if we really change our crop patterns, there is a lot of promise. But how that has to be done is still an open question. Where in some cities and some urban hinterlands, we are already having a lot of solutions being proposed and actually being implemented. For instance, in Haryana, where farmers have been actually moved away from water-intensive crops. So you have a lot of water. It's just that we need to learn a lot from countries which have moved away from water-intensive crops. And in India, there's been this move towards growing grains which don't take a lot of water. And even in this particular dimension of the problem, the kind of rural-urban water conflict, I've found that we have the mechanisms and processes and the laws still have a lot of colonial influence. And through a case study of Mumbai, I'll show all of you how that manifests itself. I was part of a study. It was led by Dustin Garrick, who's a water expert at Oxford, where we actually tried to look at the kind of urban water conflict globally. The research has been published in environmental research letters. My contribution was on India, and there were contributions on other countries, Mexico, the United States, other countries in Asia. The kind of method we chose, the kind of unit of analysis we chose, in taking our analysis forward was a diet, and looking at, we were pairing urban recipient regions and rural donor regions. So most of water is actually reallocated from agriculture to urban, okay, as a country transitions into an industrial economy. And we identified about 69 urban agglomerations worldwide. So what we actually did was we looked at large metropolitan centers, okay, more than 4 million people. And we found that there are almost like 103 reallocation projects. So really basically, looking at the literature and conducting a kind of qualitative and quantitative analysis of, where and how much water is being, is being drawn into urban areas. We found that, from our own sample that, almost 16 billion cubic meters of water were moved per year from rural areas at an average distance of 13,000 kilometers. And the benchmark year taken was 2015. So, 383 million people globally benefiting from that kind of transfer. So we, as I said, we documented this diets in North America and Asia, and found that it was in Asia, obviously, and as Asia industrializes very fast, the latter constituting the majority of diets, implemented since 2000. So water reallocation projects. And these were water transfers that were taking place voluntarily, but also involuntarily. So I'll explain what that means. These are the kinds of, water reallocation. So what do we mean? I'm just trying to kind of hide this thumbnail, which is kind of coming in my way. So, how does water reallocation occur? So one of the ways it occurs is, through land use change. Guelph is an example of that, where, the region around Guelph becomes the donor region, but it becomes urbanized itself, leading to a change from agriculture to urban water use as land use changes. And many large metropolitan areas in Asia, especially urban fringe, peri-urban areas, are witnessing the same. Chennai, Mumbai, peri-urban areas where water is drawn from wells and transferred to, the growing townships, the peri-urban areas. The second type is interbasin reallocation. One of the best examples of the classic kind of examples of that is the Colorado River in the United States, which supplies Los Angeles with water. So water drawn through long distances, right, across hydrological basin boundaries. It's still being done. Large cities in India kind of are benefiting from that as well. Delhi, Mumbai, where water comes from large distances. And then you have, existing kind of dams which have mostly kind of helped with agriculture, irrigating crops, actually, sending their own water to cities. So you have what is one variant of this is the upstream, downstream reallocation, where an agricultural donor region, which is upstream of the city, sends water. So these are the four, and the fourth type is, where you have a downstream, upstream reallocation, where the agricultural donor region is downstream of the upstream city. One example of that is Hyderabad, where Hyderabad actually uses water and then it throws it back into the river, and that water is picked up, used for agriculture, and then some of that is actually transferred to the city through a very complex process. So, so these are the four types of water reallocations which we studied. And this is a map, and I can send this presentation to anyone who wants to take a closer look at it. But the paper is there, like online, and it's free, available free. So this is a kind of sample of the studies we carried out globally. You can see that a lot of the studies are concentrated in Asia and the United States, but also some in the Middle East. So what we really found, to summarize the study was, water reallocation was occurring to a large extent, as I said, in Asia because of faster urbanization. So we really focused, and this is what my own interest in rural to urban transfers is all about, focused on contextual features, drivers and characteristics of donor and urban recipient regions, reallocation processes and institutional mechanisms. So while we were quantifying how much water is being transferred, we were also looking at, what are the processes, laws, politics, and what are the impacts on farmers and outcomes. And we found that there's a lot of, gaps in the data, this is something, it took us about 7 to 8 months, doing the research. But we found that the countries which were well documented were the United States, where, these processes were documented quite well. India, where we found at least 18 examples, China, Mexico, and Iran. And the other thing we found is that, a lot of these large cities are going everywhere in their search for water, right? Like they are going into multiple basins, far and near, and drawing water from not just dams, but also groundwater. So it's as you can imagine, it's a big ecological footprint, which cities are actually placing on rural areas. In India, you have cities drawing both ground and surface water, so which really complicates the picture a lot. Again, we don't have enough data on this. We might have missed something because we were drawing from the secondary literature, but also newspaper articles, and it was particularly challenging. So there are serious data gaps which exist. So, and researching, and most of the researchers who were actually writing on the subject were actually arguing how, identifying the kind of institutional mechanisms around water transfers is very, very challenging. So doing the field work is very challenging, but also getting information, obviously, from government departments, which are not very transparent about, how much water is being reallocated. So one could say that, the problem of water reallocation is also political, because we have large populations in rural areas. It becomes a very sensitive subject, and so engineers are very reluctant. In addition to their very technocratic perspective, on water, they're also very hesitant in sharing data on water reallocation with researchers, which makes the problem, difficult to research, and also, we don't have much information on, which could ideally inform policy. We also depended a great deal on NGOs and their reports on where the water transfers are occurring, and that was actually a very, very rich source. NGOs like the Center for Science and Environment, for instance. So Chennai was one of our big case studies. You know, where Chennai actually, for those of you who know the city, you know that it was nearing a very desperate situation last year, a kind of zero availability of water situation where they were considering, you know, they were already rationing water to various parts of the city. But Chennai, as it has grown, uh, gets a lot of its water from, you know, wells, which the municipality of Chennai has actually purchased. And some of the water is actually drawn from wells where the farmers actually sell water to the municipality. And Chennai has been going in southern India, has been going to other parts of, you know, neighboring states for water. So it's a very, very complex kind of, you know, geography where the metropolitan region is expanding and is looking for water far and wide without a lot of success. Given Chennai's geography, it has to depend a great deal on Andhra Pradesh, a neighboring state, which is always reluctant to share water given that it has its own problems. Mumbai, much more well endowed with water, unlike Chennai, which is water scarce. Abundance of water, but still problems. Many water scarce areas. One, because, you know, as I've highlighted right at the beginning, that water, there's a management problem of water. We've always had a kind of recourse taken to supply side solutions. Build more dams, you know, let's supply this part of the city with a new dam without, you know, actually considering demand management, okay, and recycling water. And this is actually a map of the Mumbai metropolitan region, and Mumbai draws a lot of its water from Thane district and Raigad. Especially, and the one thing that stands out in this situation is the kind of impact on indigenous communities, which have borne the brunt of dam building and water laws, which have privileged the city of Greater Mumbai, not only over these tribal areas, but also over, you know, some of the other towns in the metropolitan region. So, you know, I deliberately chose an example where there was scarcity, actual scarcity, Chennai, and then you have an area in coastal Western India, which actually has a lot of abundant water. And still, because of various factors, you know, fact that water is not well managed, many areas facing water scarcity, especially, you know, during the summer and late spring. And some of the things we tried to do in this paper and in my own other papers on Mumbai is that, you know, we have tried to understand, you know, why are we facing such a situation? And one of the things I've really have found noteworthy is that, you know, the rights and land for tribal farmers, tribal communities are not clearly defined. That in itself creates and or negatively impacts their entitlement of water. You know, so the state basically has a pretext to divert water from some of these tribal areas. And also you have a kind of situation where, and a kind of policy take on water where everyone assumes that, you know, more people are working in agriculture, water is actually allocated to those agricultural belts. But you know, a lot of people are working in like informal sector, industrial employment. So we don't have a very good understanding of, you know, on why we should be growing water intensive crops. Why should we allocate so much water to agriculture only and then taking it away? And also here I have found that there's a kind of nexus in one of my papers, which is published in India Review. I found that there's a nexus between, like, you know, local engineers, politicians around maintenance contracts, building large canal networks, which actually don't have any water in them. Okay. and so, you know, so it's a kind of political economy of rent seeking corruption, which is very interesting. I'll leave it out of my discussion today, but it just tells us, you know, as to how we have this on the surface commitment towards agriculture, but we are not doing anything to make sure that farmers actually get the water. And we are diverting all the water to the city because, you know, we think that the cities will pay for water and that will make the, you know, water sector more viable. This is data I kind of took from the FAO and an Indian organization which collects data on how much water is utilized in various sectors. And we find that irrigation actually uses the bulk of water. And there's almost a consensus now that we need to really make water use in agriculture more efficient. Drip, sprinkler, irrigation, and that's the key, okay? Because if we have to have viable cities, if we have to have a situation where we actually overcome some of these problems of water scarcity and water stress, we have to, be very mindful of what we are growing. State of Maharashtra, for instance, grows sugarcane, as most of you might be knowing, which is a very water-intensive crop. So, how do we change that? So, looking at crop pricing, procurement policies is very, very important. And the entire focus of, so it's all very good that we're having this focus on national water laws and national water governance, but what will matter is acknowledging that water is inherently local. Okay, and that's kind of informed my method, and also the methods of many of my colleagues who do water governance study, research. And we have to understand, for instance, in the case of problem of rural to water urban reallocation, that that context matters, and case studies are valuable. And what I found, as I said, was that some of these transfers are occurring through both formal and informal mechanisms. The distinction being formal being the state actually taking water and conveying it to a city. But then there are also informal mechanisms where you have a lot of undocumented, water trade going on, especially in the peri-urban fringe areas of large Indian cities. Sometimes done through, coercive means, water is extracted, sold, and the groundwater levels in adjoining agricultural areas are impacted. That is what I mean when I said involuntary means. And you have a lot of force being used, where you have the mafia, water mafia operating. So all this makes this subject and the kind of peri-urban areas and urban hinterlands very contested terrain for both policy and for activists, and often this is posed as an urban versus rural issue. But I think that we need cities, but we need food as well. So how to balance some of these needs is going to be very important, both for the Indian state, but also for the private sector, because we need agriculture as well. The other thing I've found, which compounds the kind of management problem, is that we have too many actors. Okay, state actors, parastatal actors, where you have municipalities, irrigation departments, organizations that were set up by the World Bank to supply water to peri-urban areas, all managing their own domains. So there's no coordination. And this is largely true of large metropolitan regions, where you have too many institutions trying to do their own thing, and it's a mess. And that compounds the problem. It compounds the problem of management. This is a classic problem in metropolitan economics, where you have this problem of what they call fragmentation. I just thought I would highlight some of the kind of research I've done which has been published in various journals, on which I'm drawing today's presentations. So to conclude, I think I'm up with my time. Am I, Bill?
Just trundle along there, Bharat.
Yes.
We'll get the questions in, yeah.
So and I know that, Guelph as an area, with all its water activism, has been of particular inspiration to me. And it also highlights the same issue. It highlights as to how, the entire kind of pressure the GTA poses on Guelph. If I can pose it that way, not a lot of people agree with how I'm presenting that problem, but there's a footprint, of urbanization on rural areas, which has become very important in urban studies and, urban political ecology. But in India, the problem is very complex. And I think we have just begun with, how we can start addressing the problem by actually looking at water governance. But we have to look at the geography of the country, the kind of varying endowments, of water in various parts
Uh-oh. Bharat. Hey, Bharat. I don't know if you can hear me, but we're kind of losing you. We may have lost you. Oh, Lord.
Can I say something, Bill? I mean,
Sure,
it's a comment, it's a question.
You're in charge. I mean, yeah, go.
Not really. I mean, I think, at the time, just before he disappeared, he was talking about how a lot of the water is actually being used inefficiently in agriculture. And he gave the example of sugarcane cultivation in Maharashtra. And I think that's a little unfair to much of agriculture that happens in India, which is actually undertaken by small and marginal farmers. They constitute about 70% of Indian agriculture. While yes, sugarcane is a water-intensive crop, that's not the only thing that's grown in Maharashtra. But from the research that we have done with young farmers in India in 2 states, in Tamil Nadu and Madhya Pradesh, one of the things that comes up is water crisis, right? We are talking about the future of farming in a country where water crisis has been a reality for farmers for more than a century. And a large part of the problem is reclaiming of land which were actually water routes, riverbeds, marshland, wetland. All of these are being reclaimed for urbanization, much like what we are seeing in Canada as well, in and around Guelph. In the past 5-6 years that I have been in Guelph, I've seen a lot of this land actually disappearing for real estate and other aspects of urbanization. So I think what Bharat was trying to do appeared to me to be rather simplistic, to say that, there is the water needs of cities, and then there is all this inefficient agriculture being practiced. And I think there is a lot more to it. There is inefficient water use in urban centers, in cities. So I think the problem is a lot more complex than, and I understand that Bharat was trying to talk about governance structures rather than these issues, but somehow I felt like, yeah.
Can I just interrupt? I have Bharat on my phone. I'm going to see if he could talk through so you guys could hear him. Would that be okay?
Is he able to sign into Zoom on his phone?
He's having issues on signing back in.
Oh. Well, let's test his audio.
Okay, go ahead, Bharat.
Hi. Hear me?
Yeah, not bad.
Can you hear Bill?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so, if I could just conclude what I was saying was that, I was trying to say that it's, while all the national governance measures, reform measures are laudatory, we are not going to be able to solve all our problems from New Delhi. We need to understand the kind of specificity of context in the case of water. And for that, we need really a stakeholder approach. So, I was not going to, I hope I was not coming across as being kind of saying that it's all agriculture's fault. But I think both agriculture and cities need to get efficient in their use of water, but that will really need a lot of reform both at the state and the local level, and also kind of recognizing that at the end of the day, water is a political topic, subject, which needs to be acknowledged, and that's the only way we can start providing answers to some of the problems. I'm sorry, I don't know what is going on with my Zoom here, but I keep going to the blue screen saying post attendee, but I can't seem to get on to Zoom. But I'm happy to answer any questions which some of you may have had representation. Uh,
Okay, Bharat, that's great. We've got a duct tape solution here that we'll see how long it lasts. Sharada was raising a point about water use in industrial agriculture versus small scale producers. Sharada, do you just want to chat about that to Bharat for us?
hello?
Oh, Sharada?
Hello?
Can you hear? We're waiting for Sharada to
Sure, okay.
Thanks, Bill. So Bharat, I understand that in this talk you're focusing on large governance issues, but I think when we talk about Indian agriculture, it's all fine to talk about sugarcane in Maharashtra being a water guzzler, but I think it's good to remember that 70% of Indian agriculture is actually undertaken by small and marginal farmers who are to a large extent dependent on rain-fed farming, right? So, so I'm not sure. I think it's rather simplistic to say, it is agriculture that is part of a large part of the problem. Yes, there is inefficiency, but so it was not a question; it was just a comment to where you,
Right.
where you
Yes.
switched off from Zoom. So, sorry.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I was not just saying, I was just not going to make a case for water efficient agriculture, but also making a case for water efficient urban areas, because a lot of our urban areas are not recycling water, and I think that's needed. So maybe I did not make that point sufficiently, but I was trying to say that both agriculture and urban areas need to get water efficient. And you have a valid point that we cannot just put the burden of adjustment on small and marginal farmers who actually eke out quite a kind of meager existence, right, through land and agriculture. So I hope hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah. So yeah, I was in a nutshell, I was trying to make the case that both cities and agriculture need to get efficient. But given that agriculture uses a lot of water, we need to have policies around crops which should be that should be emphasizing more water efficient crops. And I don't see how that can take place in a context where center-state relations are not very good, and we don't have adequate level of decentralization in our cities and villages.
Okay, so we have a question from Vinay. His audio is not working. And so he's asking, can you comment on financial resources available to water supplies?
Financial resources for what?
Water supplies. I guess this must be
water what?
Water supplies.
Financial support for water supplies. I'm sorry, I don't get the question.
Yes, and his audio isn't working. Well, I did. So maybe he can give us a little more clarity. And in the meantime, Elizabeth has a question. Elizabeth, can you ask your question?
Oh, sure. Thanks so much for that, Bharat. I thought it was really interesting. One of the things that I always think about when I think about water is also the sort of quality of water. So, is it drinkable? What kind of work needs to go into it to make it drinkable or usable? So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that issue of quality plays out in terms of this discussion. Thank you.
Can I answer that, Bill?
Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth. The water quality issue is very important, especially as if we have to, for instance, recycle water in cities, as Sharda pointed out. The burden of water efficiency shouldn't just fall on agriculture, but on cities as well. One of the ways we could make our urban areas more water efficient is by recycling the water. And that's already happening in a number of Indian cities, which have undertaken initiatives. Often what happens when you do that is that, due to certain cultural or spiritual beliefs, people may not want to consume that water. But we are again finding in a number of South Indian contexts where water is a particular challenge that kind of difficulty is being kind of overcome, where people are actually understanding that this is what needs to be done, and they're becoming less sensitive to the taste of water. But I'm not saying that it's something we can solve just through science, but it also needs a kind of some kind of cultural reworking of how people's tastes are molded. And so water quality again is another dimension, another aspect of the water quality question especially within urban India is the kind of pollution of water, right? And I think it's a particular challenge in peri-urban areas where water is getting recycled through local initiatives, but we find a lot of pollution of water because of industries in urban areas. So it's a particular challenge. So paying attention to quality is as important as augmenting quantity, which I think my presentation was focusing on augmenting quantity, or how reallocation can augment quantity of water.
Great. So there's a question from Mervyn. Mervyn, are you there? Do you want to ask it?
Hi, sorry, yes, I'm here. So I guess I'm not a water researcher, but I was particularly interested in the urban-rural conflict dimension of your talk, and I guess I'm interested in my kind of specific question, I guess, was about the how local level water activism or advocacy in the North American context, say in Guelph, can inform the same in India and vice versa, and particularly around urban encroachment into rural areas.
Right. Yeah. The one issue I find with water activism in India, especially in the kind of urban, especially in contexts where there's urban-rural conflict, is that there's very little meeting ground between urban and rural water activists. I don't know if that happens in Guelph, but I think there's less so in Canada than in India. In Canada, we've had more of a consensus on how we need to use water more prudently, efficiently. In India, because of the nature of the development discourse, things tend to take on a rural versus urban dimension. And except for certain kind of enlightened quarters, community activists in rural areas are really working on their own with very little solidarity with urban areas. And that's changing. It's changing slowly, but I think there needs to be more of a common ground between urban and rural water activists. They've not been able to work on a consensus of how to kind of face the water question, how to confront it, how to kind of advocate or present novel solutions. It's mostly about don't take my water away. This water belongs to agriculture. Well, that is fine, but one also has to see, as I said, using water more efficiently in urban and rural areas to provide an answer and a common ground for both these urban and rural activists to come together. This again is a result of the kind of development discourse in India, where you've had this entire view of urban versus rural development. We need a balance in our activism as well. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, he says thank you. So Bharat, I have a question. I'm not sure if this is your bailiwick, but I'm curious about pre-colonial governance of water, how those common pool resources were managed, and then if there are any vestiges of those management systems that remain, and could they be examples of how to move forward on water management in the future?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In the 90s, there was a lot of literature by anthropologists on this, and last decade, David Moss in particular, looking at pre-colonial pre-colonial traditions of water management, where communities would come together, especially in the south, Tamil Nadu. His case studies are mostly come out of Tamil Nadu, where there was a kind of community organization around water management. Because water was scarce, water tanks, but the only way to kind of were the only way to supply, human settlements with water. So community management was very important. And some of the pre-colonial knowledge has seeped into both the colonial and the post-colonial in a very interesting way, where the British actually during the colonial period thought that, we should do away with this kind of management at the community level. But then they learned quickly and thought that, well, let's use this. And in some parts of India, community approaches are very influential, especially in Tamil Nadu, parts of Maharashtra. And these have actually seeped into, and have influenced modern approaches as well to water in many areas in Maharashtra. So maybe my talk was very pessimistic. I should have given you all examples of the Pani Panchayat, for instance, in Maharashtra, where it's a very novel approach to decentralization. Decentralized management of water from the 90s, and I mentioned Rajendra Singh in Rajasthan. So yeah, the pre-colonial influence is there, but one also has to be careful about how some of the pre-colonial approaches at their own influence of hierarchy of caste, right? And so we cannot just advocate these solutions blindly. But on the whole, these provide a lot of promise, and these have informed the kind of modern environmental movement in India as well.
Yes, always good to add a little sweet to the salt.
Yes.
So another question. In Guelph, the issue is corporations taking groundwater and bottling it. And so it's almost this commodification of a common resource. And that's, I think, what primarily people get pissed off about, as well as the fact they're putting them in plastic bottles and creating lots of waste. And so is that commodification issue predominant? I think it's safe to say that's a fairly predominant issue in North America. Would that be the case in India at all?
Oh yes. Given the slow kind of decay of public water systems, a lot of middle class families in India go towards bottled water, and that's actually boosted the bottled water business in India a great deal. Especially Nestle and some of the same culprits we have here are present there as well. And besides bottling plants, we also have had cases of a river in Jharkhand, I think, which was actually given away to a corporation, Indian corporation. I can't remember the name of the river, but rivers are common pool resources, and so you just can imagine how unjust that might have been felt at the local level, and it became a big kind of environmental justice cause. In northern India, I was talking to the former mayor of Shimla, and he told me how Shimla, which is in the Himalayas and was a kind of water abundant region, now is a water scarce region. And one of the reasons for that was also bottling plants around Shimla, but also that when the mayor of Shimla tried to ban bottled water, he was actually approached by some of these companies who asked him why he's doing that, because he's undermining their business. Because he was trying to strengthen kind of public water provision, right, to the municipality. So those kinds of conflicts exist in India as well. They are not as well documented as they used to be in the last decade, but at the same time, this has something to do with the kind of undermining of the Indian media, right, that's taken place in the last 7-8 years. But also that we don't have enough cases being documented. There's also been a lot of pushback against these water bottling companies in southern India, for instance, in Kerala. So yeah, it's an ongoing battle, but we don't hear as many stories as we used to, and I'm sure it's still there, out there.
Okay. Sharada has a question, comment.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, thanks, Bill. In some ways, I think I'm kind of going back to Beth's question on the quality of water. And I actually understood it as more in terms of the quality of water, how potable is it, for drinking, with health consequences and so on and so forth. And since you've been talking about Tamil Nadu and Chennai a lot, and I'm sitting in Chennai, I think what the state often, in land grabs, the state is often the lead player in land grabs all over the world, and that's true for water as well, and that's true for a lot of the states that you are talking about. And while bottled water and canned waters, water in big cans, which are presumably cleaned, because the water that comes in public taps is not safe for drinking, right? So the norm now is everybody, irrespective of incomes, when they're out, actually buy packeted water, drinking water, or these big cans of water it's ubiquitous. You can see it in every household, irrespective of the income levels. So in some ways, it comes back to the governance issues, right? The state is basically saying, we cannot provide this level of this good quality, safe quality water, and it's not our business, so somebody else takes it over, right? So I think I would come back to Beth's question about quality, but from the point of view of how safe is it, and how good is it for health and other purposes.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, the fact that, we've had the state withdraw from all the provisions of water is to blame for what is going on. But I think what also has been happening is that, and again, my simple answer to that is, I think if we would have had cities which had like more powerful local governments and more accountable local governments, we would have seen a lot of difference in the water picture, especially in Indian cities. So I think part of the problem is, I mean, what you just pointed out, ideological, but also I think we've not gone far in actually decentralizing, and empowering local municipalities. So local municipalities in India, as you might know, they don't have taxation powers, they don't have a broad revenue base, so they're not able to really think for themselves and their constituencies. Right? If we would have had more stronger municipal government, we would have had much more positive results, and also an accountable and more responsible state. So I agree that part of the problem is ideological. I think you can see kind of opposition to state provision and the fact that the state itself has been underfunding water provision. Also that we need more accountable local government, which can tax people, which can actually then provide public goods. So maybe that is a very, I hope I understood your question well, Shada. Maybe this is a very simple-minded answer, but I think a lot of problems in India are actually solvable if we pay attention to decentralization, and that's true of our cities, but it's also true of water, where we need to not just decentralize, but also involve communities as stakeholders in what is going on in cities and peri-urban areas, and I think then we would have answers, right, to some of these problems. Did I get your question right?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Bharat.
So do we have any other questions or comments? Okay, well then let's wrap it up. I appreciate everyone's patience in dealing with our technical issues, and particularly I want to thank Shirley and Heather for their behind-the-scenes IT finagling with the duct tape to get the phone going with Bharat. Bharat, thank you very much. Water is...
Thank you. My apologies. I don't know what is happening. I'm still not able to sign in.
Well, that's all right. I think we gained a lot of knowledge from your presentation and the discussion.
Thank you.
So thank you, Bharat. And so I just want to mention that we are having another session on Wednesday, November 25th at 11 a.m. You will get an invite, I'm sure. Our host or our speaker will be Elijah Dalton, and he's going to be talking about the influence of cash transfers and remittances on children. And it's good. He's going to provide a case study from Bihar in India. So thank you all. It's been great. And everyone, if you're in Canada and Ontario, go out and enjoy the sunshine. It's a beautiful day. And take care. Bye, everyone.